All right, folks, today we're talking about adult sexual relationships. And to begin, we need to talk about how, for the majority of social science research, a lot of social science research has referred to adult relationships, adult sexual relationships, as being based in a market. That there's a marketplace for marriage, that there's a marketplace for dating, for having a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and that within this market we get to compare and contrast. We get to have a sort of cost benefit analysis. We get to make exchanges with respect to what we have to offer and then what our prospective partners have to offer as well. Research also shows sociologically that much of how we date and how we marry is consistent with respect to geographic trends, class, race, and education. That folks of similar education tend to get married and have relationships. The same could be said for folks who are of a particular race or ethnicity, that we're much more likely to marry somebody who has a great deal of commonality with ourselves. And this is also something that we see with respect to social class, and we'll be talking about that as well. Research shows that overwhelmingly dating is positive, no matter if it's going steady, no matter if the couple agrees to see other people, that there are different meanings and different interpretations of what dating is and what dating is actually for. And so even though it may have and mean different things to different people, we know overwhelmingly research shows that dating is positive, that it has positive emotional and it has positive physical and health benefits as well. And so you can kind of think of it like salt and pepper, that if you see one, you're likely to see the other. If you see a healthy adult, more than likely you're looking at somebody that has some kind of dating relationship that they are in or have indeed some kind of access to. And a lot of this positivity that we see with respect to dating and having relationships, a lot of this starts in the adolescent years. And so steady dating among adolescents is good for sexual identity in particular. And so a lot of that you'll be sort of reflecting on with the involuntary celibacy research piece that you'll be looking at for your first literature review paper. Now, in terms of sex, research shows that in straight relationships, men tend to initiate sex more than women, in spite of the fact that women are equally interested in sex and having sex as well. So, gender norms do matter with respect to straight relationships in regards to sexual activity. However, research shows that in the happiest relationships, both partners initiate sex equally and they both feel free to say no. So, it with that, think about it. It doesn't become one person's job. It doesn't become one person's responsibility to push the sex button. That sex indeed just happens spontaneously from the will and the intent of both partners. And they also say, you know what, maybe not right now. I got this class. I got to do some work. I got to fold these clothes, but I'll get back to you. So being able to do that, that freeing, that in and of itself, having that kind of freedom is a sexual stimulus in and of itself. Research shows also that the wealthier overwhelmingly have more sex, they have sex more frequently, they also have more variety with respect to their sexual contact, and they're much more likely with that to use a greater variety of positions. So, and a lot of this probably has to do with the fact that those who are wealthy, they have the ability to mitigate their stresses more so than people of other classes, from the working poor, from if you compare the wealthy to the middle or upper middle class. Again, the wealthy can find ways, they have the money, they have the means to mitigate their stressors and to manage their stresses a bit more. And so being able to do that allows them to raise their expectations and to create a different reality from members of other classes. Also, surveys indicate that for most couples that are intact, particularly marital couples, that in terms of their sexual frequency, they're typically having sex once or twice a week. And so if you think about how busy adults can be, if you're looking at folks in their prime years, 30s, 40s, 50s, you're working maybe 50 hours a week, you're raising children, you may also be helping out with your parents as they get older. So being able to have it once or twice a week, having that regular expectation of that may not seem like a whole lot depending on what one's point of view is, but again, that's the most common answer that couples give, that they can have it, that they can avail themselves of sex once or twice a week. So just being able to do that is significant once or twice a week, of course, again, given when we take into account and consider all the other kinds of activities, the great dimensionality of adult reality that it takes on, and all the things that adults are doing. We also find that stress is a big predictor for the lack of sexual activity. And so as it goes down, if couples aren't matching or keeping up with that particular kind of statistic, then it may also say a lot about how stressed they are within the marriage and within the relationship. You can also sort of ask yourself a question too at this point: how would COVID-19, how is COVID-19, how is the pandemic affecting sexual activity? Are couples having it more? Are couples having it less? I'll be interested to find out and see what people come up with and what the research actually says. We're spending more time at home, or we're spending more time around each other, but that isn't necessarily making partners more attractive to each other. And so there are, of course, more stresses related to the pandemic itself that also may play out within the relationship, regardless of how available the couple actually are to each other. Next up, cohabitation. With cohabitation, we're talking about living together unmarried. This is generally, for a lot of folks within the scientific community, thought to be a stage of courtship, a way for couples to continue to court and get to know each other en route to getting married. And of course, not everybody who cohabits gets married. Sometimes people cohabit serially, that is to say that they may live with several partners over the years, over their lifespan, regardless, and tend not to marry those people. About 70% or more of straight couples that eventually marry have cohabited. So it's a way, of course, to learn more about each other, to save money, to save time. It's much more efficient, and so that's one of the reasons why marriage exists in the first place, and why cohabiting exists in the first place, is because of the efficiencies that they allow for couples to glean and to ultimately maximize. At the same time, research has shown that, particularly for whites, that cohabitation incurs greater risk of divorce once married, and that the longer the couple cohabits, the greater the risk. And so the length of time of the cohabitation also increases the risk of divorce once the couple gets married. And you might think, well, that doesn't make any sense. How is that? Well, it is sort of counterintuitive, but one of the things that research shows, and this comes from the work of Andrew Sherlin, a marriage and family researcher within sociology, the research shows that in a lot of ways cohabitation has a lot in common with both marriage and divorce. And so when a couple cohabits, in a way they have two relationships going at the same time. They're in a sense married, but they're also in a sense, with respect particularly to straight couples, they're boyfriend and girlfriend. And so they have that duality, and we talk about that in sociology of role strain and role conflict. You can have that immense tension just within the expectations of marriage, just within the expectations of a partnership or some kind of life partnership. So those expectations in that one relationship, that one standard, those can become pretty difficult and insurmountable for some couples, let alone if you're in a way juggling two scripts simultaneously. So now obviously you can't live a risk-free life, so people have to take risks, and it's best to understand what the risks are before you take them, and then to just try to manage the risk as best as you can. So successful cohabiting couples, or successful cohabitors, regardless of whether they get married or not, they come up with their own rules. They come up with their own, if you will, ways and standards that they need to meet. They come up with their own expectations, and they don't wait to develop them later on down the road. And so if couples develop those early, as they live together unmarried, that becomes the best way. If they can develop those rules and stick to them, something that is simple enough to manage. And so again, think about that the norms for, if you will, the reality of cohabiting is much more complicated in a lot of respects than the reality is for marriage. So again, that cohabitation has a lot in common with both marriage and dating. And so that duality in and of itself is difficult to juggle. Also, and again, this is also a way to explain the difficulties that cohabiting can bring about. The norms for cohabiting are not as clear as the norms are for marriage. There's a much higher standard, but regardless of what height the standard is, there's a much clearer sense of what the goal is with respect to marriage and what marital norms actually are. Cohabiting means wildly often different things to different couples. And even as the cohabiting lengthens, what it may mean at one point differs from what it may have meant at another. And so that becomes the issue as well. The norms are just not clear. And we talk about that in sociology as well, the anomie, the lack of norms. And so that can happen often the longer that a couple cohabits. And again, creating those rules, creating those standards, creating those norms ultimately is what's going to be best for a successful cohabiting couple. We have had gay and lesbian marriage for the last 5 years, and research shows that in gay and lesbian partnerships and marriages that marital satisfaction and partner satisfaction is higher than what we find in straight marriages and with straight couples. And a lot of this has to do with gender, that particularly upon having children, research shows, and this comes more recently from the New York Times, research shows that having children, particularly for straight couples, is a way to sort of rigidly affirm gender boundaries and to, in a sense, regender the relationship. And so when you're looking at same-sex marriage and same-sex couples, you don't have those rigid gender norms and you don't have that rigid gender conformity. And so the lack of that provides for better communication strategies and allows for the couple, allows for them to create and maintain their own rules in a way that's outside of gender norms for women and for men. And so in a lot of respects, gay and lesbian relationships are more resilient, gay and lesbian marriages in particular, because they do not have to go through a lot of those gender issues and gender conformity issues. Also, some other trends in marriage, let me give you that as well. Yes, research shows long-term marriages, the ones that tend to last, they last longest when they have these characteristics. Number one, they view the partner as the best friend, so the marriage partner is seen truly as and is invested in as the best friend. Marriage is seen as a long-term commitment. Here's one that's kind of surprising. The married couple actually likes each other, and so you might think, well, gosh, that's strange, but that's one of the things that often happens when couples break up. They often fall out of like, not necessarily out of love. It's ironically easier to love someone than it is to like someone, and so that liking matters quite a bit. And so being able to like one another, that is really, really, really important. Also, of course, the long-term married couples, they have a positive outlook towards the marriage itself, and so they don't run the marriage down. They don't see the marriage as a ball and chain or a boat anchor. So if they see it positively, they're best friends, they see it as a long-term commitment. Those are the kinds of things that really help the marriage last, especially when they're best friends. Overwhelmingly, successful marriages, too, have a much greater ratio of positive experiences and positive attributes to negative ones. And so this comes from the research of the psychologist John Gottman. Gottman finds that overwhelmingly the healthiest successful marriages, they tend to have a much greater ratio, at least a 5-to-1 ratio of positives to negatives. And so research shows, of course, and Gottman talks about this, that all marriages and all relationships have some challenge or have some negativity, but it's if you can buoy those positives, if you can keep those positives overwhelming with respect to the negatives, if you've got a much greater number of positive attributes in the marriage or the relationship compared to the negative ones, that's ultimately what matters the most. And Gottman finds that when that is the inverse, when that ratio flips, when you have much more negative than positive, that's where the relationship gets into trouble, and that's where it gets into difficult waters that are hard to chart. Research shows also, and this comes from a number of sources, the New York Times has been doing a series on this for a while, a number of articles they've done on this for years. Research has shown that at least since the 2000s, that those with college degrees are much more likely to get married than those without college degrees. And so in the past, cohorts, different education cohorts married roughly the same amount, no matter how much they've gone to college or not. But quite frankly, we're seeing that that is not the case in recent memory and in the present, that overwhelmingly if you go to college you're much more likely to get married. And in a lot of respects, research shows that college education makes you more marriageable. It makes you more attractive. It means that more than likely you are going to be able to get a good job that pays enough to support a family. You've grown beyond high school. You've met people beyond high school. You've developed yourself. You've probably developed from that college education more interests, more passions, more hobbies. You've had more experiences. You've traveled a bit. And so all of those things enmeshed with that college education are a sort of set of protective layers that allow you to meet somebody that's also having and has had the same experiences. And so this period that we're in now is often because of that called peer marriage, that today you're much, much more likely to marry your best friend, especially if you're college educated. And so with college education, you've got privilege. Ultimately, you've got this power that the couple reinforces back and forth from one person within the partnership to another. Again, you have gainful employment that pays enough to support a family in the case of both jobs and positions, that allows you to secure middle and upper middle class status and standing, with hobbies and interests that you have in common, friendships that you've built, and all of those things support the marriage. So research has shown, for instance, that more recent marriages that we've seen since the 1980s into the present, those marriages are less likely, these more recent ones are less likely to end in divorce. And again, it's because we're in that peer marriage circumstance where more than likely you're marrying your best friend, somebody that you actually like and respect, and that you have common traits and also common hobbies and interests with, that you want to do with that person. So in prior cohorts, particularly if you think of your parents, your grandparents, particularly your grandparents and your great-grands, they didn't really have to like each other to get married. That was not a precondition for marriage. They didn't have to have the same hobbies or interests. They really had to sort of pair off in terms of straight marriage. Women were in the home and in the community, men were in the labor force, and so those kinds of things, those gender rigidity norms, if you will, those gender norms are ultimately what allowed for the creation and sustenance of a lot of marriages in particular. And often that became, in some cases, pairings became disastrous because people didn't necessarily know one another. And especially if you look at the changes that were wrought after the Second World War in particular, the opportunities that came and developed and grew allowed for couples often to be pulled apart, especially if they didn't have that much in common in the first place. And so again, today we tend to marry for like, and we tend to marry for the better, not for the worse. Where, if there's a decline in marriage today, where we've seen a decline in marriage is amongst the poor and the working class, particularly amongst those, again, who have less than a college degree. And so it's the economy that discriminates against that person and against those couples that makes for that to be an impediment to marriage. And so if you're poor, if you're struggling, if you're working class, that's often one of the worst things, ironically, you can do is to get married, because the marriage only complicates things even more. And so it's the inability to secure gainful, secure employment that becomes a limit, that becomes a problem with respect to the poor and working class marrying. And so in the past, particularly with union membership being higher and with jobs that paid better, in the past those jobs were much more of a ladder, much more of a foothold, not only within the working class or the working poor, but it allowed them to, in a sense, mature out of those standings and get into the middle class. We don't really have that many ladders to upward mobility today, and that's one of the reasons why, unfortunately, we don't see marriage as high within working class and poor communities, particularly, and that's consistent with less education. And so that's what discriminates ultimately against poor and working class people. The economy itself and the system of education itself. All right. Divorce. Now, depending on who you talk to, some say, well, there's a 50% divorce risk, a 60% divorce risk, and so on and so forth. But think about what I just mentioned, that quite frankly, more recent marriages are more stable and more resilient. Again, and it's often because of that peer marriage reality and the fact that we are more college educated and college degree today than our parents and grandparents tended to be. So not every cohort, not every grouping of people within society has the same divorce risk. So in a way, that statistic about 50% or 60% is not really the best, most accurate statistic to use. It's better to use something called the refined divorce rate. This really is the number of divorces and annulments per 1,000 people in society. And we find that more recently, for the most recent years for which that data are available, and this comes from the Centers for Disease Control, we're looking at 3.65 divorces per 1,000 people. So that refined divorce rate is ultimately a way to sort of control for the different risk factors that certain age groups have of and for divorce. So when you look at it that way, it's not like everybody's having a divorce or every other person is having a divorce. And again, for some of you who are younger, and you may or may not want to tell your parents this, you're probably not going to put up with things that your parents did within their marriages, or your grandparents certainly. And again, it's because, especially for those who are college degreed and college educated, you can set the bar higher, and you can again select someone who has common attributes that are going to help you grow as a couple and help you develop wealth and some lifetime security. All right, we also need to talk about the fact that divorce takes a toll on your health, and this comes from the research of sociologist Linda Waite. And she finds that those who've divorced have a causal connection to declining health outcomes. And so that might be one of the reasons why we see a little less divorce amongst the college educated couples today. They probably are more aware of the risks of divorce and what it's more likely to do. It's not that college educated people don't get divorced, we're not saying that, but they're less likely to compared to those with less education. And again, they probably know that the risks are heavy in a lot of respects with divorce and what it does to your health. And so Linda Waite finds that mobility limitations are common amongst the divorced, as well as coronary events such as heart disease, high blood pressure, that these kinds of illnesses and diseases become much more common amongst those who are divorced. And so there's something about the stress, the very heavy stressors of the divorce experience, the planning of it, the execution of the divorce experience itself often brings about these very, very difficult, dreaded, negative health outcomes. It's not that people shouldn't get a divorce, but it is very critical that folks investigate the implications of what divorce can do to one's health. Those who remarry, they do have a rebound in their health, but again, Linda Waite was able to show that the research demonstrated that even upon remarriage, their health was still compromised compared to what other cohorts that had not divorced had experienced. So divorce does have a negative causal effect on one's health. And we also need to talk about affairs, extramarital, extra-partner affairs. And so research shows that those who cheat, they tend to have a stronger interest in sex, not so surprising there. They have more opportunity for sex outside the relationship. That becomes one of the big ones as well. They know more people that they can have sexual experiences with. Research shows that they've also had more partners over their lifetime than those who do not cheat. Overwhelmingly, the research shows too that those who have affairs and have cheated, they have unmet emotional needs. So a lot of what happens too is they may get bored or they may feel like they're unloved, and then the affair allows for them, it gives them the ability to have some kind of excitement type of experience. For men though, research shows that having an affair can also be bad for the heart. So this can have physiological outcomes and incur a greater risk of some kind of heart attack or other kind of coronary heart event. So the very stress of availing oneself of an affair can also bring about these negative health outcomes as well.